Today's episode is brought to you by AAA, roadside assistance that's #1 in customer satisfaction. So why should you get AAA? Because bad roads, bad tyres, bad weather and bad luck. Maybe you're out of gas, out of juice, blocked out and out of options, or you're in a pickle, in a ditch, in need of help, in the middle of nowhere. To put it simply, you get AAA because stuff happens. And you're backed by the most highly recommended 24/7 roadside assistance that's along for the ride, no matter whose car you're in. That's right, your AAA membership travels with you. Plus you get all kinds of other perks too, all for around $65 a year. So don't wait for car trouble to sneak up on you. Join today at AAA.com. and be prepared when stuff happens. AAA. Expect something more. Roadside assistance is provided by independent facilities contracted by AAA. Coverage in taxis, limousines and other ride-sharing conveyances is excluded. 2023 AAA US Market Track National Surveys. Offers, terms, conditions and policies are subject to change without notice. Visit AAA.com for details. Welcome to episode number 258 of Real Life Ghost Stories. And to kick things off this week, I would like to say thanks to some of our newest Patreon subscribers. I would like to thank Catherine Richberg, Sans Foster, Katie, Josephine Oman, Ashley Barnett, Ian L. Pomerantz, Echo BB 006, Debs Carrock, Bailey Maguire, Jen, and Marl in OK. Thank you so much for subscribing to the Patreon. I love you and appreciate you every single day. And our film review this week. Our film review is Starve Acre. Starve Acre was released in 2023. It has 5.4 out of 10 on IMDb and 84% on Rotten Tomatoes. When their son starts acting strangely, a couple unwittingly allow dark and sinister forces into their home, awakening a long, dormant, ancient evil rooted deep in the countryside. So as always with these film reviews, I'm going to do some likes and dislikes, and starting with the likes, this is based on a novel of the same name called Starve Acre, obviously, and I haven't read it, so I don't know much about the novel. I know that Sinead from The Poisoner's Cabinet read it and really enjoyed it. To me, this film felt like the epitome of slow burn folk horror. So if you like folk horror, you're going to like this film. I think it was the best film in the world? No. But did I enjoy it? Yeah, I guess I did. So I love Matt Smith as an actor. I just think he has the most stunning face. Like, I just love to watch him on screen. I think his face is just so watchable. I did read a review of this film that said that that Matt Smith's face looked like it was carved from the stones of the Yorkshire moor, in contrast to Morfydd Clark's face that looked positively avian. That's what the review said, and I was like, wow, I don't think that had the impact that you think it did. But he was brilliant. He gave a stunning performance, and so did Morfydd Clark. They both gave sort of gorgeous, understated, calm, soft performances, and they did that while simultaneously portraying like the grief and tension and sadness and loss really, really well. I think that Morfydd Clark is an absolutely stunning actor. So if you've seen the film Saint Maud, she is the actor who plays Maud, and that film had such a profound impact on me. I don't even think I did it as a film review. I remember Dan and I watched it and we were both really upset by it, in terms, like, it's just a really difficult thing to watch because you're watching a woman slip into religious psychosis, and it didn't feel right to, like, I don't know, talk about it as a horror film, but it really shook me when I watched it, and because her performance was fantastic, and like that in this, she is fantastic, as is Matt Smith. The atmosphere of this film and the landscape it's just phenomenal. It's set up in the Yorkshire moors in the 70s, and it's just grim. It is sort of lonely. It's wild. It's vast. And it's really beautiful, and that kind of landscape really lends itself to the slow menace of folk horror. There's so much you can do with the landscape in order to get that atmosphere right. And also in terms of folk horror, I loved the use of the hare as a symbol for the horror in the story, because hares are obviously like bigger rabbits, but they also are such a seemingly innocuous animal. But in this story, the hare becomes almost parasitic. And in folklore, hares are often seen to be creatures that are witches' familiars. They are creatures that witches can turn into. They've quite a sinister little place in folklore, I think. And English folklore isn't really my forte. Like, I don't know loads about English folklore, so I really was fascinated by this and the pagan roots and this idea of the ground holding all of these secrets and the generational impact that this folklore and paganism and pagan beliefs had on this family. And I really appreciated the use of folklore as a means to explore ideas of grief. I think it's really important, and I think it's, the more that grief is portrayed on screen in different ways, the better, because grief is complicated, and if it is explored and like portrayed in all of its messiness and weirdness, then I think it's better for people in the long run. And in regards to the dislikes, like, it's a slow burn, okay? This film is slow and atmospheric, and it lacks in kind of big scares and terror. You're not going to be like having nightmares. You're not going to be like while you're watching it. It just is more so like a curious, menacing environment. And in saying that, I did find myself zoning out a number of times, and then I was like, oh shit, I'm going to have to rewind. What the heck just happened? Now, granted, it is also important to remember that I often watch films at 10 o'clock on a Monday morning, which isn't the best time to watch horror films, but sometimes it's the only time I can fit it in. And, maybe that doesn't add to the scare factor. There were also elements of the CGI in this film that maybe weren't great. I have to say they did a lot of practical gory effects really, really well, but there were elements of it that were a bit oh, okay, that's not great. I remember last year or maybe the year before, I watched the Icelandic horror film The Lamb. This is very similar vibes, very similar feelings. I sort of left this film and The Lamb being a bit oh, that was good, maybe, question mark. If you like folk horror, it's definitely worth a watch. You will enjoy it. If you'd like to explore some folk horror, I think this is a good film to explore that with, because it explores the themes of folk horror and kind of explores them in a really engaging way, I think. But fundamentally, is it life-changing? Probably not. I'm going to give it 3 stars. Maybe 3.5 because of Matt Smith's face. And for our story this week, I am joined in the virtual studio by the wonderful, the glorious, the shiny Tim Cloke.
Shiny. I'll take that.
You described yourself as shiny earlier, okay?
You
so
are
that's
quite
why
right.
I went for it.
It is accurate on this occasion, isn't it? Yeah. Are we going to give any context to that?
No.
Okay, that's fine. We'll leave that there. Hopefully
He's
people will agree, I think.
Yeah, I would say
it's lovely to be back.
It's lovely to have you, babe. I'm so happy to have you back.
It doesn't feel more than about 10 minutes ago we were recording for 31 Days of Terror, does it?
Yes, and that was crazy. That was a crazy amount of recording we did for 31 Days of Terror. It was wild.
Yeah. Occasionally it was too much. I mean, I was getting on to mention Gettysburg goat stories and things like that.
Which I really loved. And I sort of, because you're so good at this, I sort of love it when you make a mistake.
Oh, I'll try and slip some in for you tonight. Don't worry.
because I'm like, haha, he's not perfect. I know in the edit that he's not perfect.
Far from it.
And as always with these episodes with Tim, we are recording virtually, so the sound quality might be different than you are used to. We are also both cat parents, so there may be cat interruptions from time to time. Unfortunately, the cats own us. We have no control over this. it is what it is. So Tim, what stories are you bringing us today?
Well, today we're going to be looking at some Cornish folklore. Now, this is something that
Woo!
I've been thinking about doing for a little while, but I'm having to be very careful, as I kind of mentioned in my introductions. You've already done some wonderful episodes on Cornwall, haven't you? So there are certain things I'm definitely going to be steering clear of.
Yes, I have done some episodes on Cornwall. Do I remember what they are? No, but I've definitely done them.
I think we've had some talk about Bodmin Jail, haven't we?
Yes, Bodmin
And
Jail,
Jamaica Inn.
Bodmin Moor, the Jamaica Inn. Yeah, we've done all
So
those.
I'm steering clear of all of that. Also, I do have some plans for the future to do one of my moorland expeditions of the folklore of Bodmin Moor. I would love to go up there and have a proper long walk. It is not legal to wild camp there, so for the benefit of this recording, I'm going to say that I won't be doing that. But it would be wonderful to explore some folklore of one of the other West Country big wastelands and moorlands, and in that case, Bodmin Moor. So not just because you've covered the town of Bodmin itself and the nearby Jamaica Inn, I would like to just save those stories for Bodmin. But the other thing is that Cornwall is so rich in its folklore that there are so many other things that I could do. So I've got a mixture of some really old folk tales here, which will kind of blend into some of the ancient monuments that are there, because I know that we enjoyed discussing that over 31 Days of Terror when we looked at Britain's ancient stones. There will be some Pisky lore as well, and we know we like talking about that. And there will be some just good old-fashioned ghost stories in there as well, with a little bit about a local eccentric vicar. So plenty to discuss tonight.
Oh, that sounds like a great mix. We got big old stones, Piskies, an old vicar who's eccentric. What more do I want from a story?
What more do you want? I realise as well, very unprofessionally, I'm saying tonight as if that's when people are going to be listening to it. But we are recording this reasonably late in the evening, aren't we? So I will try to avoid saying that where I can.
Before we start, Tim, I would like to point out, and I do this every time because I think it's really important to note, that Tim works full-time as a teacher, and then late into the evening, post-gymnasium, he has said, yeah, let's do a recording. So it is late. And it does take a lot of work to put these episodes together. Tim just does that. Like, I don't offer any guidance or, editing or anything in terms of the writing and researching of these episodes. This is all Tim. And it does take a lot of work to put them together. And I'm eternally grateful. And the listeners are eternally grateful. And we love you for it.
And you are very, very welcome. And you're very kind to say so. I think it's becoming pretty obvious now that I tend to have episodes ready immediately after school holidays. Have you noticed that by any chance?
Who'd have thought?
But genuinely, I really enjoy doing it as well. I mean, the title, some long train journeys over the Christmas holidays, and I was researching and reading. I've got some really good books and typing away, and I've really loved it. So now I'm excited to actually get there and read some stories. So are we ready to get into it?
I am ready.
All right, let's go. Cerno, Cornwall. A peninsula, in fact, but a cultural island in its soul. This land of mystery and folklore shares an identity related to and yet distinct from those other Celtic nations at the fringes of the British Isles. Separated from England by the waters of the River Tamar, flowing from north to south along a remarkably straight course, Cornwall was once more isolated than it appears today. Bordering only Devonshire to its east, the Tamar was once a far more formidable barrier than it is today. Modern bridges, tunnels and railways mean that the border can slip by virtually unnoticed today. Yet it does not take much for its comparative isolation to become all too obvious. Drivers see that as the M5 motorway runs out at Exeter, the traffic crams awkwardly onto the A30, Cornwall's only and inadequate trunk road. With the seasonal rushes of holiday traffic, cars and caravans and coaches alike find themselves nose to tail struggling to enter the county. When winter storms wash away the coastal railway lines or essential repairs close the Tamar Bridge beyond Exeter and Plymouth, Cornwall finds itself cut off from the railway network at a stroke. Its comparative nearness to England has meant that its Celtic identity has been subject to even greater pressure to assimilate with the Englishness than its Breton and Welsh neighbours, and yet Cornwall can push back. It's seen that the Cornish language might at one point have been at the point of extinction, preserved only in text and as echoes in place names. But it is resurgent. Cornish people, young and old, have increasingly striven to hold on to the language, learn it, and speak it. Bilingual road signs are more common than they were even 20 years ago, and a sense of genuine nationhood grips more and more of its people. For this reason, and for an affection for this unique land, place of my father's birth, I will try to make the distinction between Cornwall and the English so-called mainland apparent. Cornwall's mineral wealth was tied up in its tin mines, its global reach in its Atlantic-facing harbours, and its folklore seeps from every ancient stone circle and runs along every narrow and winding lane. So I invite you all to this proud land of tradition and say, Cerno Agas Didech, which I believe means welcome to Cornwall in the ancient Cornish language. So what are your memories of Cornwall, Emma?
I had a lovely time. I drank a lot, probably, because I was with Nick and Sinead.
Yeah.
Cornwall is beautiful in a really gorgeous, wild, isolated way. I really enjoyed my time there. I was really struck by really the sort of ragged, wild beauty of it all. You know, it really is breathtaking, and it is one of those places that you just sort of can't quite describe it. I also have a particular love for the fact that the Cornish language was in danger of going extinct, and people are making a massive effort to keep it alive. I think that's as an Irish person, I think it's incredibly important when you have a language that maybe is not as popular as it once was. The importance of keeping it alive is it's incredible. Even down to things like having bilingual road signs. That's a huge step towards preserving a language.
Really matters, doesn't it?
Yeah,
because it just makes it every day and brings it into the normal, which is so important.
And that's how you keep a language alive. You make it every day in little ways, and that's how you keep it alive.
It's taught in schools increasingly now as well. So that's part of the sort of cultural capital that Cornish, particularly primary school children, get as well. The thing that really strikes me about Cornwall is just how narrow it gets towards its sort of most southwesterly extremities. It's not that unusual for you to be stood on high ground in Cornwall and be able to see and both coastlines at once. And the coastline, it goes in and out, and if you follow the Southwest Coast Path, which is one of the best walking routes in the whole country, then you get a sense of just how long that coastline is. But it is so tiny, and you get so hemmed in, and there really isn't that much room for expansion. And so unlike a lot of other places, it just hasn't developed in the same ways, but in a completely charming way. But like so many of the other Celtic traditions, it holds on to some of its wonderful old traditions and the old stories. And I had a Cornish nan and a Cornish great aunt who I loved dearly when I was a kid, and they used to tell some stories, and frankly some of those were just stories about the family. But the old stories of Cornwall are very much like those stories that you hear in Ireland, that you hear in Wales, and that you hear in the other Celtic nations, but they are still Cornish rather than being more generally Celtic.
Yeah, and I do like this sort of, that it is a Celtic nation, but also that it has its own eccentricities, and its own specificities. I can't say that word. You know what I mean? And it's really it's really specific to that part of the world, and I do love that. And
the foods as well. Let's not forget you've got Cornish pasties, which are so filling and lovely, and I know we've mentioned it before. You get the cream tea, which is also a Devon thing, but in Cornwall they put the jam on first and then the cream on second, and we're not going to have too many arguments about that right away. There's bound to be some people who might be wanting to comment on that already, but there's also it's by the sea, so fishing is such a hugely important part of the cuisine down there, and it's got wonderful fields for cows and sheep and everything else, and it's a great climate for growing vegetables as well. So the food down there is something else. It really is a special part of the country. But I thought we might start with our friends the Piskies. Try and get out the way, let them get in first, and then hopefully any disasters that follow will be managed.
You are speaking my language. Let's go.
Let's go for it. We will begin our tales in somewhat familiar territory, that of the realm of the Piskies. We are always ready to tread gently when encroaching on their folklore, and I have told several Dartmoor Piskie tales already. Cornwall sits on a rich seam of valuable tin. We know with certainty that this resource has brought wealth to its people since prehistory. Tin is an essential component of bronze, from which tools were made in the centuries before iron became more prevalent. Roman historians and records relate to the importance of this tin to the Cornish people and the trade to the Romans themselves. The Cornish people, of course, being called the Cornovi, or the people of the horn-shaped land. Perhaps the most famous Pisky tales are those of the Knockers. I have related their tale before in relation to the Dartmoor Tinners, but it bears at least brief repetition. Cornwall's most famous dish, the sustaining and substantial pasty, is also a favourite of the fair folk within the tin mines. Legend has it that Cornish miners, their fingers fouled with dust and even arsenic residue, would hold their pasties by their thick crust or crimp, and then discard it into the mine for the knockers to eat. In truth, the hard-working and ravenous miners could scarcely waste so much of a calorie-laden pastry in such a way, but crumbs and dropped lunches inevitably did make their way into the shadows of the mines. Some say that the grateful knockers would try their best to keep the miners safe. They would knock upon the walls, warning of impending collapse, allowing precious extra seconds for men to escape. It is true that in the days of wooden pit props, the pop and creak of strained timber would give some warning of the shifting dimensions of the adit. But the mine owners were greedy. They delved deeper and deeper into the hillsides in search of tin, and left smaller columns to support the roof. This encroached on the realm of the Pisky knockers, whose warnings were less often heard and less often heeded. In many places, as the mine got too deep, the knockers would instead pound against the stone, no longer warning of collapse, but causing them in their anger. By the time the first bangs were heard, the miner's fate was sealed. A cynical interpretation might give another answer: iron. Most Pisky folk will appreciate a gift of iron in the form of a pin or a nail that they can repurpose. However, as the tin mines got deeper, wooden props were replaced with iron. Fewer were needed, and spaces could be opened up. The miners could relate how wooden props would speak to them, so to speak. A creak and a slight moan was not need for much alarm, but as the pressure grew, the steady splintering of timber gave ample warning for escape. Not so with iron. When it failed, it did so with a great bang, as strong but brittle pig iron shattered under the weight. One after the other, bang, 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 until within their reach was buried forever to rest with the Piskies. And what would they hear further up the mine? The dull knock, knock, knock from the bowels of the earth, and the tragic knowledge that there would be more empty places at many dinner tables that evening. Not all Cornish Piskies are alike, however. Most of them are benign and even helpful folk, if a little mischievous. On the south coast, they assist the fishermen and the women mending the nets. On the north coast, they help the farmers in return for a few stolen sweet treats from the larder. The more sinister Piskies are to be found on the higher ground around Bodmin Moor or Carn Bray near Red Roof. Moorland farmers find stirrups matted into the manes of their ponies, and it is said that the Piskies are known to steal them, riding them across the hills, terrifying cattle, but usually returning them. Tales of being Pisky-led have been told before, but the jack-o'-lantern legends exist on Cornish hillsides and valleys too. One Pisky is considered queen of them all, and she's known as Joan of the Wad. A wad was a long archaic term for a flaming torch, and Joan might guide a lost traveller back to safety with hers, or otherwise lead her fairy followers into laying a false path to confuse and confound the unwary. Other Piskies live amongst and around the ancient stones of Cornwall. While Piskies are described as being childlike and tiny in appearance, the fair folk who guard the ancient stones are larger and more wizened in appearance, and are sometimes called Spriggans. Some suggest the Spriggan folklore may be an echo of the Cornish Druids, long since displaced as Christianity and the saints colonised their ancient sites. Although most archaeologists would suggest that the evidence points to these being mostly Bronze Age in date, some 3,500 years ago, folklorists offer other explanations, which I invite you to believe if you wish. Take the Dawnsmen or the Merry Maidens Stone Circle, near picturesque Mousehole, spelled Mousehole for anyone who's heading down there. The Dawnsmen is a corruption of the Cornish Dance in Man, or the Dance in Stone, making the Merry Maidens the more accurate name if the legend is to be believed. Many years ago, a wedding party danced long into the evening. The priest warned the youthful partygoers not to overstay their welcome, and certainly not to be found partying past midnight and into the Sabbath. His warnings were, of course, dismissed as the grumblings of an old curmudgeon, and the festivities continued. Sure enough, as the Sabbath dawned, the maidens dancing in a circle were instantly turned to stone, their weathered remains still standing as a warning to this day. In a similar vein are the stones known as the hurlers. This formation of stones is unusual in that there are 3 separate circles in close proximity to each other. The tale goes that each of them was a team of men huddled before playing the ancient Celtic sport of hurling, who were turned to stone for daring to play such sport on the holy day. Such stories today are fun, but easily dismissed as folk tales warning against anyone forgetting their Christian duties, and many similar stories may be found all over the British Isles. However, I will conclude with my favourite bit of pisky and old stone folklore, the tale of Men Toll. This stone may once have been part of a larger stone circle, of which perhaps 4 stones remain. However, it is different to virtually all other sites. Men Toll is a broad stone on its side with a perfectly circular hole through its middle. Located in the far west of Cornwall between Pendeen and St Ives, it isn't quite unique. The nearby Tolvan stone outside Gweek to the south is similar in form. It is said that a Spriggan fairy guards the hole, but he is a benevolent spirit. As long as visitors to the stone bear in mind the lunar cycle and various other rules, a visit to the stone can have a healing effect. It is said that passing through the stone in the right direction at the right time of year and the correct number of times, typically 3 or 9, can have a miraculous effect. People with back injuries report being cured, and it is believed that children afflicted by rickets and tuberculosis could similarly get the aid of the Spriggan in curing their ills. However, there is an obvious symbolism to this stone. Men may have ignored, willfully or not, the significance of children passing through the stone and the associations with the lunar cycle, but perhaps far fewer women would miss the obvious feminine symbol that it provides. Indeed, it is said that women who pass through the stone on a full moon will find their fertility instantly boosted. And so, local women desiring a child might be well advised to take careful notice of the monthly cycles of the moon and the fertile properties of Men Toll. Who knows? There might even be something in it.
I mean, maybe there is something in it.
Maybe there is.
I just have to say that while I always mute myself when Tim is talking, so while I was muted, Hades launched himself at the laptop, knocked over everything with a big clash and a bang, hit the microphone, wrapped himself around the microphone, tried to unplug the microphone. It's not been great, I have to say, but it's fine. We're good.
This is an occupational hazard. I'm very glad I didn't see that because I don't think I'd have held it together.
No, you would not have held it together because it was just me in sheer panic and then Hades' big face in the camera. I love that there is such an element of like environmentalism with pisky stories and the stories of the knockers, where it's like you do too much of this to the earth and they're not going to be happy and they're not going to help you. They're not going to look after you. You're going to piss them off royally. And I guess it's, old school ways of being like, should we be doing this much damage to the earth? I don't really know.
Do what I really like about it, though, is that so much of the pixie or pisky folklore that I've read about Devon and other counties is a lot more dangerous than the stuff we're talking about here. These are some of the most benevolent pisky stories I've heard.
It's quite sweet. Like they're quite like, you've got Joan of the Wad, which also a great name.
Really
like even Spriggans. Like nobody can be worried or scared of Spriggans.
No, they're these just sort of lanky guys with very long beards, very druidic looking. But again, they're there to help you and to heal you. And actually, basically as guides, they're there to make sure that you don't make the mistakes. I'll tell you what I absolutely loved about these stories, though, is just how when the Victorian antiquarians sort of started reassessing these stones, and when other antiquarians who kind of love to combine the local folklore and stories that they were told with what stones there are in a sort of pseudo-archaeology, they were all sort of well-to-do men. And the significance of lunar cycles and fertility was completely lost on them, it seems. Whereas actually, if you just stop and think for even half a second, it's so obvious. And it seems that the people who maybe built these stones, and certainly the people who created these stories around them, it's so obvious to them. And it speaks to a particularly feminine folklore, which you don't get with so many of these other ancient stone stories.
Yeah, I do love a bit of feminine folklore. And I do love the fact that you were like, it would not be lost on a lot of women that this may have been a feminine symbology.
You can almost imagine them raising their hand at the back and they're just being ignored and thinking, oh, okay,
Yeah.
well, fine, all right, as usual.
Yeah, there's that whole joke, isn't there, in archaeology where like male archaeologists for years will be like, we don't know what this object was. It was purely for ritualistic purposes. And then a woman will come along and go, oh yeah, it's for sewing. Like just really easily, really clearly. Yeah. Oh yeah, that's for this.
Yeah. Oh, my grandmother had one of those. Yeah.
That's basically obvious. For doing this.
Yeah, it's why we need more women in archaeology and more women in science, if you ask me. But it's such a wonderful story, and the local folklore around actually going through these stones is so fascinating because you don't find them anywhere else in the whole of the country, and yet you've got two of them here. And the similarities with the Welsh language, which I'm a little bit more familiar with, despite the fact that I'm actually half Cornish, are really obvious. And so, because in so many of the Celtic languages, the word for stone is mine or men or something like that. You can see how that would be so easily corrupted into the modern translations of the place names, but they really are just talking about the stones themselves.
Yeah.
And even Tolven, and Van would be a Celtic corruption of mine, because sometimes the consonants do change to make it easier to speak. Although I'm sure for any Cornish speakers who are listening, I'm so sorry for butchering your language. I've not had any particular training in it, and I am doing my best. So we go on to something slightly different now. In fact, you might even say that this is right at the other end of the scale.
Let's go for it. Let's do it.
Our focus shifts now from the tiny folk of Cornwall to age-old tales of giants. Cornwall has a number of giant stories. Like the Piskies, some of them benevolent, and others less so. One famous landmark near Penzance is the Cheese Ring. This is a hilltop pile of boulders, so named from its resemblance to a pile of cheeses. In this case, those with a lactose intolerance will be glad to hear that in Cornwall, a cheese may also refer to the compacted mass of apple flesh and skins that results from when the fruit is pressed into cider. Legend has it that a giant atop the hill had a stone throwing competition with a local man and piled upon the stones ready to throw them. Clearly, the competition ended before he could use all of his stones. Another giant who enjoyed a harmless game with the local people was the giant of Carngalva. He would help locals build their homes, play at stone throwing, and was generally a harmless presence. He, like the giant of the cheese ring, delighted in precariously balancing stones so that he could lie on them and gently rock himself to sleep. Sadly, though, most giants were bullies, plain and simple. Take, for example, the giant known as Cormoran and his giantess wife, Cormelian. In the distant and forgotten time in the bay off Penzance was a forest, long since submerged by rising seawaters. Cormoran lived on the rocky mound in what is now Mounts Bay, and according to some stories, built it with a bit of help from his wife. St. Michael's Mount is something of a mirror of Mont Saint-Michel in Normandy, in that it is a rocky island accessible at low tide by way of a causeway, and playing host to a monastery and a high-status home. Its name in Cornish, Carrac Lws and Cws, translates to the grey rock in the woods, a reminder of its alleged former geography. Cormoran terrorised the local people and took great pleasure in the fact. He would stride onto the mainland and steal sheep, cattle, whatever he wanted to eat. He wasn't always known for habitually stealing human beings, but that didn't stop him from peering in through windows and giving the inhabitants a fright whenever he wanted to. What the local people needed was a hero, and a hero they found. Set against the mythical backdrop of the Arthur legend, we come to the tale of Jack the Giant Killer. A local lad, a farmer's son named Jack, finally tired of Cormoran's raiding. He wasn't a remarkably strong boy by any means, but he was fearless, and he was happy to rely on his wits to defeat the giants who had long held local people to ransom. A council was formed in Penzance, and Jack told them that he could defeat Cormoran if he could keep all of the giant's substantial trove of treasure if he succeeded. Jack made his way out onto the island at St. Michael's Mount, whilst Cormoran was distracted by his latest raid for oxen and sheep. Knowing that he could not defeat the giant through strength alone, Jack instead applied his skills as a farmhand in digging a hole. A very big hole. Working tirelessly, Jack hacked away until he had enlarged a crack in the rocks into a trap hole. Placed behind obscuring rocks, he waited for Cormoran to return. The giant gorged all night on the livestock he had stolen, until finally falling into a gluttony-induced slumber. At dawn, Jack took his chance. He blew a horn to wake his drowsy foe. Cormoran was enraged and blundered over the rocks towards the young Cornishman. He failed to see the trap, and he fell headfirst into the hole. Jack taunted the giant before taking up his pickaxe and plunging it deep through the giant's skull, killing him instantly. True to their word, the council awarded Cormoran's treasure to Jack. Cormoran's heart turned to stone can be found in the causeway to St. Michael's Mount to this day, and his roaring ghost can still be heard raging at Jack the Giant Killer. Jack had made a name for himself, and next set about dispatching the giants Blunderbore and Rebex, who had been the bane of the people of Penwith. Such was his reputation that King Arthur himself appointed Jack to be his son's guardian. Not a bad promotion for a lad from a Penzance farm. St. Michael's Mount really is a fascinating place to this day. Variously a monastery dissolved by Henry VIII during the Reformation, to a fortress, and latterly a luxurious stately home, it is now under the stewardship of the National Trust. Accessible on foot at low tide, or by a regular but bobbing ferry boat at all other times, it is one of the spookiest places I can remember visiting as a child. My brother and I pored over the cobbles to find the giant's heart, which of course we found, probably 4 or 5 times over. Within the great house at the top, we were told a spine-chilling tale about guests coming into contact with the spirits. In one room, with its views looking out over the sea, it is said that a playful ghost is known to pinch people on the arm, causing them to wheel round in surprise, only to find the room deserted. One of the drawing rooms has fluctuations in temperatures, as a ghost of a lady, sometimes appearing as a distinct apparition, glides in and out of the room. My favourite tale, though, acting as something as a postscript to the Jack the Giant Killer story, relates to an alarming discovery. Although well recorded, tantalisingly, this discovery was made just long enough ago for it to be considered as much folklore as history. Sometime in the 17th century, about 100 years after the dissolution of St. Michael's Mount Monastery, a secret chamber was uncovered in the wall of the chapel. Such priest holes were not unusual in this time of religious upheaval in England, from the break with Rome through to the Civil War. But this chamber, which still exists and I have seen, is somewhat larger and grander in its architecture than most. However, the truly remarkable discovery was further concealed within this already hidden space. A skeleton, well preserved and measuring 7 feet 8 inches in height. Nobody has ever been able to ascertain to whom these remains belonged. But could this be at least the origin of the Cormoran giant story? Or, given that the story is tight-lipped on the fate of Cormelian the giantess, could this have been her mortal remains, reinterred when the monks made the mount their home? I'll leave you to believe whatever you'd like to believe.
So to be clear, the skeleton is not in existence now?
Nope.
It is just said to have been found, this 7 foot, whatever it was, 7 foot 8 inches skeleton.
That's right. Yeah, it appears to have disappeared sometime at the time of the Civil War. There was even more upheaval in Cornwall for that about 100 years of the Reformation, because Cornwall hung on to Catholicism at one point, and then it was very staunchly Protestant at another. And so there was all sorts of things going on there. But there are actually a good number of historical sources that support that a very unusually and remarkable in its size skeleton was found within this concealed space. And I can tell you for sure that the space is genuinely there to be a concealed space. It's hidden sort of behind a wooden doorway behind the pews within the chapel. And it is very hidden. You wouldn't know it was there unless you were looking for it. But there is nothing in there now that can tell us anything about the skeleton, if it ever existed. But I like to think it did.
I'd like to think that it did too. Do you know what, right? Giant people have existed and do exist to this day, as in people who are just bigger. You know, whether that is they are fundamentally, like, you know, loads of basketball players are like 6, you know, into 7 feet tall. And then you've got people who have like medical issues that mean that they grow exponentially big and whatever. Like all of those medical issues and genetics existed all those years ago too. So there would have been people every so often that would have been like mad tall, and people were smaller then, right? Or am I making that up? That is historically true, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. I mean, you just need to look at sort of bones and nutrition, and you can see that people have got a huge amount taller even in the last 100 years, let alone in the last 300 or 400 years.
So I'd like to think that those giant stories, that's where they come from, and that obviously you know, a story gets passed from village to village, and all of a sudden the person is 12 feet tall rather than, you know, 6'5" or whatever it is. It's like, do you know the Black Shuck story up
Yes.
in Norfolk? And they actually did find bones of an unnaturally big dog. And it's like, well, you know, maybe that's where part of the story comes from, that there was actually a really big dog that somebody had.
Yeah. And also, I like the idea as well that if there was somebody who was unusually tall, even 7'8" tall, you can imagine that they would have been quite a celebrated figure, and it might have been seen to be quite miraculous. So the idea of the monks at St. Michael's Mount Monastery wanting to preserve their remains and give them a special place within their monastery, I think is really entirely realistic.
Yeah, totally reasonable. Like, of course, you're going to see somebody who is literally has that huge stature. You're going to be like, oh my God, this person is enormous. So we are going to pay them some sort of reverence, whatever that means. You know what I mean? So yeah, I understand. Like, totally, they'd have that person in the wall, and maybe it was just a giantess.
Maybe it was. I really like as well how famous things like the stories of Jack the Giant Killer are.
Yes.
And of course, the Cornish claim them as their own. I'm sure there are other places that do as well. But the specific nature of the talk of being hired by a council of Penzance, and I really would urge anyone who is in Cornwall to make their way down to St. Michael's Mount, because I do think it is one of the loveliest places in Cornwall, but it is really far down in Cornwall. You can hardly go any farther before you are heading towards places like Land's End, right at the end of England. But it is a place that I maybe went to 3 times before I was about the age of 13. And every single time at various points, it would give me, my hairs would stand up at the back of my neck. But it's wonderful for kids as well, getting them to look for the stone of the giant's heart. And there are various ones there, and they say, oh, it's that one there. Oh, no, it's that one there. And they really are heart-shaped. And I'm sure that really is the giant's heart as well.
Of course.
But it's got a bit of everything there, and I really would encourage people to go. And there are some wonderful stories about it. And who knows, you might have your arm pinched as well by this ghost.
Yeah, there's not only are there giants, but there's also never forget there are still ghosts knocking around. So you cannot rest on your laurels.
And it's got a fascinating history as well. I mean, from memory, St. Michael's Mount Monastery was one of the monasteries in the country that tried to adhere to every single one of the impossible and ludicrous rules that Henry VIII was introducing. And regardless of what your opinion is on the history of the dissolution of the monasteries, it appears that these were guys who were trying to do their best. They said, so we have to say that we're following the king, not the Pope now? Okay, yes, we'll go along with it. Oh, we have to do a new prayer book? Yes, that's fine. We can adjust that. Just leave us to our religious seclusion and we will follow all the other rules. But of course, it was a doomed venture, wasn't it? It was always going to be a case that they would be closed in the end. And I think they got them in the end on the fact that they'd given away all their money to charity. And they said, but now you're worth less than £200. And so we're going to close you down. So it really was a catch-22.
Yeah, there was no winning, was there?
Never was. And maybe there's 1 or 2 angry monks still knocking around there now.
Listen, if I was a monk and I had done everything that I was told and then they were still like, haha, I'd be like, I am pissed off, okay? Because living as a monk, like, it's a simple life, but with that simplicity comes a lot of, it's tough, you know what I mean? Like, it's not an easy life. So I'd be thinking, oh, Jesus Christ, I'm desperately trying not to swear.
It's all right. It's just because my mum told you off. That's what it is, isn't it?
Yeah, that is what it is. She's in the back of my head, and I'm so conscious now. I'm like, stop swearing on the podcast.
She's going to be so proud of you, you know.
All the years of my mum and dad, my own mum and dad, being like, please stop swearing. And like I said to you, my dad making me do a New Year's resolution that I would stop swearing. Yeah. And it takes your mum to make me stop.
It's just occurred to me, I think I might have sworn once, but I think I'll get away with it.
No,
I'm in trouble now.
Yeah, I hope you are in trouble. I hope she tells you right off.
Yeah, she will. She absolutely will. Oh dear. Right, best behaviour from now on, shall we?
Best behaviour, yeah.
Well, look, we've looked at some of the tiniest people of Cornwall. We've looked at some of their biggest ancestors as well. But now I think it's time to get into some good old-fashioned ghost stories. What do you say? Well,
that's what we're here for, isn't it?
Let's do it. I'd like to conclude, with some extension, with some more conventional ghost stories. In this respect, as I sometimes do, being a glutton for punishment, I will place on myself certain restrictions as to which stories I tell. For one thing, this will allow me to choose from the many hundreds of Cornish ghost stories that there are to tell, leaving plenty of scope to revisit this topic at another time, should we wish to. On this occasion, I'll be avoiding the folklore of Bodmin Moor. I've begun making plans to visit the moor with my pack and tent, much as I visited Dartmoor in the past, and I hope, if it is desired, I might be able to devote a whole episode to the tale of Bodmin Moor, as I've researched. Also, I'll be avoiding further mention of Arthurian legend, given how woven into Welsh folklore Arthur is too, and to be frank, the stories of Arthur and Tintagel could command an episode all of their own. I will therefore be telling the tales of places that I personally have visited and remember well, and fondly. In this, I have been aided greatly by a slim volume of ghostly tales called The Ghosts of Cornwall. Published in 1983 by prolific paranormal writer Peter Underwood, this was my reading material as I rested atop Lower White Tor last summer. It has proved to be a valuable starting point for my research, containing several stories about which I knew nothing, and, more pleasingly for me personally, reminding me of some stories that I had heard before but forgotten or misremembered. Where possible, I will give my own impression of each site, which I will hope add colour and authenticity to each tale. Our first location is in Cornwall, but only just. Located by the banks of the River Tamar, just as it begins to widen as the river meets the sea at Saltash and Devonport, Coteil is a picture postcard pretty and quaint little place. We had easy access given that the family friend was a warden of the National Trust and the organisation that owns the quay and the house at Coteil today. In the past, this section was easily navigable to small coastal sailing ships, and despite its current appearance, it was a small part of the burgeoning industrial revolution, with limestone and other goods transported from Coteil. Crumbling mills, overgrown leats, and cobbled paths provided endless entertainment for us energetic children. In my childhood, my family and I had fairly regular visits to Coteil Quay, and this would often involve a walk up to the Tower Folly nearby or a stroll to the grand late medieval house at Coteil. At times, the path up to the house seemed to plunge away on the side down to the coffee-brown and slow-moving waters of the Tamar. I remember being brought up to just such a viewpoint to be told about the daring escape of Sir Richard Edgecombe. Outraged by the murder of the princes of in the Tower, he joined the 1483 rebellion against Richard III, because I have to mention him every time I do an episode and I can. The rebellion soon fell into disarray, and Sir Henry Trenowth of Bodrugan was set on the trail of Edgecombe. Trenowth's brutality was well known to all, so Sir Richard used his local knowledge to his advantage to escape capture. He heard Sir Henry's soldiers approaching and made one last desperate bid for freedom. Filling his hat with stones, he threw it as far as he could over the steep drop into the Tamar, and then fled in the other direction back towards the quay. On seeing his hat floating downstream, Sir Henry's men reported Sir Richard Edgecombe as drowned in his attempt to flee. Sir Richard would return in 1485 as part of Henry VII's victorious forces, and on regaining his estate took part in an act of satisfying justice as he pursued Sir Henry over the cliffs on his horse at a place now known as Bodrugan's Leap. Such stories fired the imagination, but the interior of Coteil House added to this. All stone, shadows and tall ceilings, Coteil is a house with features that straddle the late medieval and Tudor periods. Most of the furniture and fittings are original, as the Edgecombes moved to Mount Edgecombe after 1553, thereafter only occasionally residing at Coteil. In the oldest part of the house, there is a recurring haunting where distant plaintive music is heard playing, often accompanied by the smell of old perfume or fresh herbs. Indeed, other stories seem to fit with the idea of a female spirit, briefly making her way from room to room. One such story concerns the nurse who was attending to the 5th Earl of Mount Edgecombe during his final illness, as recently as April 1944. The nurse saw a woman in white walk into and then through the Earl's bedchamber, where the door had been left ajar to let the spring air provide him some relief. Thinking little of it at the time, she was later joined by the housekeeper. Noting that the housekeeper was dressed all in black, in keeping with the mood of the household, the nurse asked, "Have you changed your dress? Because when you passed through the Earl's room, surely you were wearing a white dress." The nurse shook her head and explained that she had neither changed nor had she been working anywhere near the Earl's room. The nurse protested. "Oh!" exclaimed the housekeeper, as if hit with a certain realization. "You saw the ghost. Well, we see her all the time." All this was delivered as if it was the most matter-of-fact thing in the world. 40 years later, a similar apparition was seen in the same part of the house. A guest reported seeing a young woman or girl in flowing white descending the stairs from the direction of the bedchambers. Mrs. Phyllis Julian, then a resident of the house, explained that while the girl was a rare apparition, she was known to appear from time to time. However, that same Mrs. Julian was also quick to point out that Cotehill House has a very welcoming atmosphere, despite its age and history, and that there are no malevolent spirits that seem to reside there. A visit to its quaint gardens, historic quay, and grand halls can be like stepping back in time. But it seems if you see a ghost, you can count yourself extremely unlucky. Or lucky, depending on your point of view.
It's nice to have some positive ghost stories every now and then, you know? Where it's
I really agree with you.
They're not going to kill you. They're not going to, set your shit on fire. They're just knocking around doing their own thing.
Yeah, we've got a couple of really horrible ones coming up, so I will try and balance it out a bit. But,
well, listen, it swings and roundabouts.
Of course it is. But what I really like about this is that, by and large, the Piskies have been benevolent. Many of the giants, apart from Cormoran, have been benevolent. And now we've got some benevolent ghosts as well. Just paying a little visit to the 5th Earl of Mount Edgecombe as he's on his deathbed.
Yeah,
not seeming
and
to do any harm.
Being there all in white, not doing any harm, just passing through, maybe keeping an eye, having a check on him. Obviously didn't come with any sort of negative atmosphere.
No, not at all.
That
but
the person who witnessed her was like, oh, that must be the housekeeper or another nurse or whatever. So
do you know what? If any ghost wants to start haunting my house and filling it with nice perfume smells and music, then go ahead. I've got room.
You've also got Lily. Lily does that for you already. She meows to you and fills your house with perfume. Like, what more do you want?
That is a certain type of music, especially the music when she's had dairy, which she shouldn't have had. But probably the less we go into that, the better.
The less detailed, the better. But I feel like that was unfair to Lily, and I think you should apologise to her later.
I'm very sorry, Lily. Do you know what? She'll make me pay in some way. She'll probably just jump on my head in the middle of the night or something. We have got more ghost stories to look at. So should we have a look at our next one, which is rather different in tone?
Let's crack on.
Our next location is the hilltop town of Launceston, or Lanson, depending on how you want to say it, and depending if you're one of the locals. Dominated since the 11th century by its intimidating Motte and Bailey castle, built to subdue the local people by the cousin of William the Conqueror, Robert Count of Mortain, the basic outline of the old town remains, little changed for centuries. On an old road skirting the northern boundary of the original walls, but just outside, is the distinctive frontage of Acre House. Remodelled constantly over time, it still retains its 5-gabled front with a distinctive row of steeply pitched roofs. Within this house, in 1728, died one Elizabeth Hurl in grisly and appalling circumstances. Records of the day state that her husband, Nicholas, Mayor of Lanson, had accused her of being possessed. In earlier times, one so-called treatment for such an affliction was starvation. But by the 18th century, such barbaric practices were already considered unlawful. In truth, it is likely that if she was behaving in an untoward manner at all, it would likely be the result of a mental health crisis, or perhaps, given what transpired, a simple case of her being trapped in a violent and sadly abusive marriage. Eventually, it seems Elizabeth escaped her confinement, only to be shot dead on the stairs by Nicholas, who successfully pleaded that the discharge of the gun was accidental. Within living memory, old folk of Lanson claim that there remained an indelible bloodstain on the second step from the bottom, which was only removed when the timbers themselves succumbed to yet another renovation. One might expect the unfortunate, even justifiably vengeful soul of Elizabeth to haunt Acre House. But apparently not. Though he died more than 200 miles away from the house in which he, as it seems to me, did so much evil, it is the spirit of Elizabeth's notorious husband that is trapped within Acre House. The most unusual haunting concerns an eccentric tradition of the residents of Acre House. Each generation gifts the next a walking stick. As of the 1980s, there were 13 such walking sticks, with those belonging to previous residents being kept stored in the loft, rolled in a canvas case. The first odd happening is that whatever jumbled order the sticks are put away in, they find their way back into chronological order again. Some witnesses even claim to have heard the rattle of the walking sticks above their heads as the process is undertaken, perhaps by unseen hands. As the tradition developed, the eccentricity and uniqueness of the sticks increased. One has a secret vessel in the top of it for poisoning the unsuspecting. Another is a sword stick, cunningly disguised, a deadly sharp rapier blade. However, the most odd of all is a stick fashioned from an old flute. The flute itself could no longer be played, as in order to make it into a usable, if unusual, walking stick, one end had to be blocked up. Or at least, nobody alive could use it. Residents to the house report hearing mournful flute music emanating from the attic in which the walking sticks are kept. And they say it is the belatedly repenting soul of Nicholas Hurl who plays it. Others claim that the flute plays to signal the impending death of a member of the household. An omen surely to be feared.
Okay, this was a great story.
Do you like that?
Yeah, I wish you had seen my face because you were obviously reading, and when you said that he got away with it, like the accidental discharge of the gun, I literally was like,
yes. Honestly, I've described some pretty unlikable characters in some of these stories before.
Yeah.
He might be one of my least favourite. Such an example of someone in a position of power and influence, just being able to do whatever the hell he likes. I mean, how I can actually describe him without swearing about it, that's for you, Mum. I really don't know, because he's just so bad. And it made me actually quite angry just to read about him. But he seems to be trapped there with his flute stick now.
It's pretty grim, isn't it? And you think she went through so much and he took her life away from her and there were no repercussions. You know what I mean? There was nothing. Like if you don't get punished in life, maybe you do. Maybe in death he ended up bound there forever. And it's like, listen, mate, if you weren't such a terrible person in real life, I'm desperately trying not to swear again. If you weren't such a terrible person in real life, maybe you wouldn't be stuck in an attic playing a flute for all eternity miserably.
Yeah, and I hope it is miserable as well. Because if you ask me, he took her life twice. So he took her life once when he married her, and then treated her so abominably. So that, I mean, if there really was any unusual behaviour, as you might call, from her, I can imagine that the horror of living under those circumstances would be quite enough to do it.
Yeah, I'd
but
be
then he takes it
behaving
more literally
too if I was in that situation. Let's be fair.
I mean, these are remarkable looking houses, though. The Dock Acre house and this kind of row of 5 houses, which probably would have been one when it was built, but is now 5 separate houses. It's a remarkable looking place, and you can still go there quite easily now. My dad was actually born in Launceston, or Lanson, as they call it, down in Cornwall. And it is a remarkably preserved little town, and it's another one that is definitely very, very well worth visiting. But here's a nice little Celtic link. I know this is nothing paranormal, but I like these bits of symmetry sometimes. In Welsh, so many places begin with a double L-A-N, and it's pronounced, roughly speaking, Llan.
Yeah,
now,
I can't do Welsh pronunciations.
Nor can I, probably, as people will tell me. But I spent 3 years there at university, so I have had a little bit of practice. Well, Launceston, you might think, refers to the castle. Often the place names in English, they finish Seston as to mean like the castle of. It comes from the Latin caestra, meaning a fort. But here it's nothing of the sort. It's another one of those wonderful Cornish corruptions. It actually comes from Lan Steffan, the Church of St. Stephen.
Okay.
And that explains why the locals call it Lanson rather than Launceston, because it's actually much closer to the original correct pronunciation.
That Lan is much closer, isn't it?
Yeah. So those of you who are wondering why do so many places in Wales begin with Llan, it's because it refers to the church. Like, of course, the famous, and I'm going to show off now, Llanfair Pwthwingig o Gerach Wynjobol Llantysilio Gogogoch, which is a made-up name for tourists from Wales, but it basically just describes everything that's in the village, including all the churches. So that's why you get that so often. So that's why it's Lanston.
I'm honestly so impressed with that.
Oh, did you enjoy that?
Yeah, I enjoyed that a lot.
It's only 3 years of practice, and
I know, but it's every time you do it, and I've heard you doing it before, and I'm just like, every time I'm like, yeah, that's impressive, that's good. Get that on your dating profile. I don't know how, but get that on your dating profile.
Well, I got a video on it on the YouTube channel, so maybe that will count. Someone just asked me to put that together at work, and so I went, yeah, it's 5 minutes work. I'll do that. But we are sort of digressing a little bit there. But what a great reminder again of the Cornish language just seeping through. And you know what? I'd say more than that. It's very much resurgent, and I love it. We are going to conclude, though, with the place in Cornwall, which is more familiar to me than any other place, because it is where my dad was born. It's where I spent most of my weekends as a child. And I think you're going to enjoy some really lovely stories from here. I may well go on a bit of a tangent about a bit of a local hero.
Okay.
And I'm nervous about this. I've warned you about this when we were texting the other day.
Okay.
There is a risk I'm going to sing in a part of this.
Oh my God. Hook it to my veins. Okay.
I'm not a singer though. And the thoughts, I'm going to have to put it out of my mind. I can't think of the fact there's going to be actually people listening to this. But there is a famous song which we're going to have a look at as well. So there's going to be part ghosts and part a tribute to a local eccentric vicar.
I'm going to say this to you now, Tim, before you start, right? I need you to cast your mind back. I know you didn't see this production, but about 2 years ago, I was in a production of 12th Night where I played Feste, famously the singing fool.
Fool, absolutely.
Now, Tim, can I sing? No. But am I loud and confident? Yes. And that is half the battle, in my opinion. So just keep that in your brain. Loud and confident.
This is the song that, generally speaking, gets sung at Cornish rugby matches. And I'm going to try and channel some of that energy. And if it's terrible, just cut it out and replace it with someone doing it properly. In fact, if you can find a rights-free version, even put it on at the end of the episode, because it is a wonderful, wonderful song, and it pertains to one of the tales we've got on here. But anyway, enough of this, of me getting nervous and getting myself tied up in knots about singing on a podcast. Let's just get into it and see what happens, shall we?
Let's go.
Our final stories concern the villages around the seaside town of Bude. Today, Bude is something of a hotspot for tourists. It is also the hometown of my father. So for many years, virtually every weekend, we would head back home, as Dad would say to me, to see my nan, my auntie, and enjoy the best roast dinners I've ever had. Seriously, I will never know how they did it, as they took that secret of those roasts to the grave. But I suspect the answer involves unhealthy amounts of salt and rendered fats. But I digress. Bude is now the most populous town in the area, but before the arrival of the much-missed railway and the express loads of Victorian tourists, Bude was little more than a fly-blown fishing village. As a local saying put it, Stratton was a market town when Bude was just a furzy down. The village of Stratton, about a mile to the east, was the more prosperous settlement, even mentioned in the Norman Domesday Book of 1086. But while Bude has boomed, Old Stratton has remained almost unchanged, and some important aspects of its history have faded from memory altogether. On the road between Stratton and Bude now stands a retail and industrial park, one of the few parts to see significant development. Within it are a leisure pool, large supermarket, and several new housing developments too, all built in the last 30 years or so. Binnamy Road once led to a farm of that name, of which now virtually no trace exists. However, south of the industrial park is a curiously undeveloped square of land covered in tangled and unmanaged trees. These stand atop the much degraded earthworks that are all that remain of Blanchminster Castle. Built in the 14th century, Blanchminster, or Binnamy Castle, was really more of a moated manor house, built to show off the prestige of the Lord of Stratton, Sir Ranulph or Ralph de Blanchminster. Sir Ralph had gone on crusade, and, as so often happened at this time, he seemed to disappear, and nothing was heard from him for many years. At length he returned to Stratton, much to the amazement of his newly remarried wife. It seems Lady Blanchminster had acted in good faith, and the church had been satisfied by the circumstances to declare the marriage over, and while heartbroken, Sir Ralph accepted his wife's departure from his life and his estate with resignation and a heavy heart, but no malevolence. Such a difference from the last husband we described. He and a small retinue of servants and retainers lived out his remaining years within the moat of Blanchminster Castle in seclusion. Having little need to spend his wealth on himself anymore, it seems Sir Ralph became a generous benefactor to Stratton until he died, possibly from the Black Death, in 1348. His will paid money for the upkeep of the church, alms for the poor, and arms and weapons for the Stratton militia. So much did he leave that the foundation called the Blanchminster Charity remained active until the late 18th century, over 400 years after his death. Perhaps predictably, the rare visitors to Blanchminster Castle, for years on private land and now barely accessible beyond modern housing, described the sadness of the site, and a very few in the days it was still on active farmland claimed to have seen his apparition. So far, nothing particularly unusual. But what set one account apart was the precise nature of the description of Sir Ralph. He was described as walking mournfully along the outer ramparts of the castle, but walking a few feet above ground level. Stories of apparitions apparently walking through ground, apparently at knee or even waist deep in modern structures, are often explained through the accumulation of layers above the original floor level of the ground. Here, the opposite appears to be true. The sad spectre of Sir Ralph walks along the top of a now neglected and eroded earthwork before vanishing in front of disbelieving eyes. When asked why he knew it was Sir Ralph and not some other soldier, an old landowner remarked that it was obviously him. The chainmail coat and gambeson, partial plate, surcoat, and padded coif upon his head, all typical of the era in which Sir Ralph served, and they match precisely the degraded but surviving effigy above his tomb in Stratton Church. Whether the farmer, doubtless a parishioner at this church, saw the effigy and applied this to what he saw, or otherwise simply described faithfully what his senses told him at the time, is a matter of debate. What we do know is that Blanchminster Castle, while a scheduled monument, is virtually forgotten both nationally and locally, and is listed on Historic England's Heritage at Risk register. How many other potential witnesses to Sir Ranulph's ghost have been unable, through a lack of access, been able to see his spirit? Perhaps as time, rain, tree branches, and heaven forbid bulldozers erase the last vestiges of this castle, so too the restless spirit of Sir Ralph will likewise fade into nothingness. Now we can pause there before we get to the singing bit.
Yeah,
But what do we do with Sir Ralph?
That makes me really sad.
It's such a heartbreaking story, isn't it?
Do you know what I wrote down?
Go on.
400 years later was when they finally got to the end of his money.
Yeah, that's crazy, isn't it?
That's
it just shows
crazy.
you how rich he was as well, doesn't it?
It shows you how rich he was. And also, fair play to him. You know, I've got lots of thoughts about big wealth, as you know. But he looked at, his life and he said, my wife deserves better. Which, fuck me, like you said, I'm sorry, I take it back.
This has become the running joke of the episode now, hasn't it?
No, I'm sorry. Which comparative to the previous episode or the previous story, good, fair play to him. But also he went, well, I've got all this money. What am I going to do with it? I'm going to give back to my community. That's what I'm going to do. And for long after my death, I'm going to give back to my community. And now it's a heritage site at risk. And I hate that.
It's really sad, isn't it? What really occurs to me as well is people of his generation, they existed to pass on their wealth and their titles to their sons.
Yeah.
And he didn't have that. That one thing that gave a purpose to his life outside of service and outside of his military expeditions was the idea, well, I will one day have a son or perhaps a daughter, but probably a son who will take my title, who will take my wealth and will keep it within the family. And that is how I will serve my ancestors my descendants going forward. And when he realized that he was never going to have that, he seems to have actually turned it into something of a positive. And I've spoken to my dad about this. He grew up in this area. He knows it like the back of his hand. And he'd sort of vaguely heard of this place, but he had no idea that there were such substantial remains left underneath this place. And then when I described it, he goes, well, actually, no, I do remember there were trees there and things. Oh, we should go there. And he's talking about, we'll go down there at some point, which we've not yet done, but we will do at some point. But Stratton Church is really familiar to him. He went to school in there. I mentioned Blanchminster. He said, well, there was a Blanchminster Hall. I remember it when I was a kid. There were boys used to go there. I bet that's something to do with his legacy as well. And you know what? He's probably right.
Yeah.
In terms of the kind of the credibility of the story, I love that sense that he's floating above the ramparts, because of course he would be, because they've eroded.
Yeah, of course. So it's he's not actually floating in his, in his time, in his wherever he is in the universe. He is standing on the ramparts, surveying his land, whatever it is. But of course now it's going to look like he's floating.
Of course. And I think that's a really, really cool story. There are lots of these little earthwork castles that you get down in Cornwall and in other parts of the West Country, and in fact all over England. And most of them are kind of forgotten. But I think this is one that really ought to be remembered. And I'm glad to say I found out actually just yesterday, there is at long last a Buname Castle historical group who are trying to save it.
That makes
So
me
that is
happy.
encouraging. I haven't got too much more information about them at the moment because like I say, I literally found out about them yesterday after a tip off from my dad. But yeah, it's a really encouraging thing that they are finally taking some notice of it and saying, you know what, this is a rare survivor and we need to do something about it. And if it opens up and becomes more accessible, who knows what you might see.
Yeah, exactly.
Shall we go on to our next Bude-related story then?
Yes.
A few miles north of Bude, dispersed in and around one of the many small green valleys that plunge into the violent swell of the Atlantic, is the village of Morwenstow. Its ancient Norman church, now isolated from most of the village in the bottom of the valley, has some of the finest Norman carving in all of Cornwall, with distinctive and in some ways unnerving dead-eyed heads of men, beasts and birds. The rector of this church for some years was the famous Cornish poet, the Reverend Robert Stephen Hawker. His most famous poem, turned into a song, has become an unofficial national anthem for the Cornish nation, the Song of the Western Men. Its lyrics allude to the imprisonment of Sir Jonathan Trelawney, the Bishop of Bristol, who had been imprisoned in the Tower of London by the Catholic King James II in 1688, in the lead-up to King James's overthrow in the Glorious Revolution. Though the song references a rescue force of Cornish soldiers, in the event, such an expedition was unnecessary. Trelawney was acquitted 3 weeks later. Nevertheless, the song makes a stirring anthem, sung regularly at rugby matches and more. A good sword and a trusty hand, a merry heart and true. King James's men shall understand what Cornish lads can do. And have they fixed the time and place, and shall Trelawney die? Here's 20,000 Cornishmen will know the reason why. And shall Trelawney live? And shall Trelawney die? Here's 20,000 Cornishmen will know the reason why. It's a wonderful, stirring tune. Hawker was deeply devout, but he was also very eccentric. He refused to wear anything black, except for his socks, and he would allow his many cats to roam the church, though he did once excommunicate one in jest for mousing on a Sunday. He helped remodel the nearby rectory, designing chimneys that resembled the church towers of every church he had worked in. Hawker introduced the modern interpretation of the Harvest Festival, which still fills many churches with fresh produce and corn decorations at the end of the summer. Along a narrow footpath clinging to the edge of the cliffs close to the church is Hawker's hut, the smallest of all the properties managed by the National Trust. Turf-roofed and half-buried in the cliffside, the hut provides a sheltered viewpoint within which Hawker looked out over the Atlantic surf, smoked his opium pipe, and allowed his poetic inspiration to flood in. This eccentricity should not distract from his considerable personal courage, however. Many places claim to be made from the reclaimed ship's timbers, but this is in fact quite rare. However, the story checks out for Hawker's hut. Hawker would head out of the hut on the worst stormy nights to look out for ships in trouble, as so often would be the case in this part of Cornwall. He did his best to organise rescues, call out the lifeboats, and sometimes drag men from the boiling seas. Tragically, many a drowned sailor had to be carried with reverence up the cliffs to be buried at Morwenstow Church, with Hawker often assisting in the recovery of their bedraggled and broken remains before presiding over the funeral service. The preserved ship's figurehead of the wrecked Caledonia of 1842 can still be found in the churchyard, a marker for the grave of 5 of her crew. A granite marker for 30 or more mostly unidentified seafarers laid to rest at Morwenstow bears the simple, moving inscription. Unknown, but well known. Words chosen by Hawker. All this, I confess, is a huge tangent. A brush with a local character and the folklore that surrounds him. It carried with it the most tenuous segue into our actual paranormal story, one concerning a possibly nautically acquired haunted object. About 3/4 of a mile south of Hawker's Church is the ancient manor of Tonacum, dating back to the 13th century. The manor house itself is no stranger to hauntings. Visitors report hearing knocking coming from the windows. That's right, coming from within the house. They also report hearing heavy objects being dragged ominously across the floors. Apparitions of a short, bald man in 17th century costume and of a woman of a similar era have been reported too. The most famous and often seen, though, is the misty apparition of a woman in grand Elizabethan costume carrying a set of large, heavy iron keys. This is reputed to be the spirit of Catherine Kempthorne of this manor, who died in 1613 and is buried and commemorated in the aforementioned Morwenstow Church. The story that is more curious than all of them concerns a large cedar wood chest. The style of this chest suggests that it is of the late 16th century. Its construction and decoration suggest a Spanish origin, and these details combined have led to the inevitable suggestion that the chest is part of the spoils of war from the defeated Spanish Armada of 1588. The top and sides of the chest have a grisly decoration. Along with the Spanish coat of arms, there are arms of a different kind. Severed limbs and heads surround the box. A resident of Tonacum in the mid-20th century was Mr. T.A. Lay, who bought the chest from an antiques dealer who claimed to have bought it from the box from a pair of sisters. These sisters were said to have been deaf and supported each other in their later years. They apparently wanted rid of the box, as wherever they placed it, things would be pushed around and damaged. Mr. Lay was sceptical, to say the least, but the price was right, and the chest intrigued him. A deal was done, and the Spanish sea chest came back to Tonacum. Soon, Lay regretted his decision. Pictures in the manor began to fall from the walls, and so he placed it in the old armoury out of the way. And then the guns mounted on the walls began to fall to the ground, all still attached together with their retaining wires, with no damage to the mountings. The chest then went up to a bedroom. While hanging some curtains, Mr. Lay was struck on the head by a painting coming off the wall, despite his being 18 inches from it, and with Mrs. Lay as witness. Perhaps just as oddly, struck may be too strong a word. The picture merely floated and touched his head, before then clattering to the ground. After yet more pictures had been sent earthwards, enough was enough, and the chest was removed to a vacant room. Enough local interest has been generated, though, that the story appeared in the local press, with the Lays posing by it for a photograph with some of the objects the poltergeist of the chest had seemingly tampered with. A local curate, on seeing the photograph, recognised the chest and immediately contacted Mr. and Mrs. Lay. He claimed to have encountered the sisters who sold the chest, who had related to him in writing that their deafness was the result of shock from when they were younger. They had both witnessed the heavy lid opening, peered inside, and fainted from the awful sight they saw within it. This tale stretches all credulity, but the interest of the curate had been roused enough through its similarity to a story he had heard in his youth. Sure enough, in an 1882 edition of so-called Authentic Narratives magazine in London, there was a tale of an army surgeon who came into possession of a box with a very similar description to the Spanish chest, now haunting the Lays' home. It recounted how the surgeon had opened the box to see the dead eyes of a man with a cut throat staring back at him. Despite his experience of gruesome wounds, the surgeon dropped the lid in fright, only to open it again and find it empty. Whether there is any truth to the surgeon's story, or that of the two sisters, is up to the individual. But after a brief but intense period of activity, the Spanish chest and any energies attached to it seem to have quietened down, and they now accept their new surroundings. No further disturbance was ever recorded. With that, our brief exploration of paranormal Cornwall comes to a conclusion. Though in truth, we have but dipped our toe into a turbulent Atlantic Ocean of potential stories. Some of these tales may rightly be dismissed as tall tales, especially those about giants, others as pure make-believe, and yet some as credible hauntings. However, they all make up the rich and fascinating culture of this proud and westernmost projection of mainland Britain. With retelling, may these stories live on and attract more people to Cornwall's rugged beauty. For now, I'll sign off by saying, Cerno bis Vican, Cornwall forever.
The singing was divine.
Thank you very much. I only sang one verse in the chorus.
It was stunning. It has made me really think about that time I did that show. I
Yeah.
don't know if loud and confident really cut it, actually, in hindsight. So
I think I've woken the neighbours.
if anybody did see that show that I did, I apologize for my singing. And Tim would have played the role exponentially better.
I did realise about halfway through. So if I falter at all, I did realise that it's gone 10 o'clock while we were recording this. And
Yeah.
I probably have just woken my neighbours, but sorry about that. I'll buy them some chocolates or something. It'll be fine.
Neighbours are like, is he fucking watching the rugby in there? Like, what's going on?
Well, if I am, they'll be wondering why I'm watching Cornwall. But I must say, actually, one of my happiest memories of my kind of Cornish side of the family was seeing Cornwall rugby team playing at Twickenham against Gloucester. And Twickenham holds tens of thousands of people, but there were 8,000 Cornish people there. And bless them, there were only 500 people from Gloucestershire. So you can imagine how outnumbered they were. And so when people were belting out Trelawney as they hung a giant pasty over the crossbar of the rugby post, you can just imagine what the atmosphere was like. And I do urge people, there's some great versions on YouTube. Look it up, Song of the Western Men, the Cornish national anthem. Even if you're not Cornish, it'll stir something within you, I think.
Yeah, I love a good rousing verse. It's great.
And also, I love the fact that the harvest festival traditions were just so common. At least, I'm not sure whether they are worldwide, but in England and in Britain more generally, I believe, the harvest festival tradition of bringing in all that food and distributing it to local people and decorating the church with corn, all this stuff. This is started by Reverend Hawker, who's just a regular old, well, he's not regular, is he? But he's just an ordinary, otherwise, parish priest or parish rector in Cornwall. And
what an amazing
man with
legacy.
a truly fascinating life. A wonderful legacy. And I wanted to mention him because although he's not paranormal, he has his own folklore, and I think he deserved it.
Yeah, I think it was a lovely mention. I also loved the unknown but well known.
Yeah, it's beautifully chosen.
That's a beautiful tribute.
Yeah. Sometimes it's the simplicity is actually what speaks so much more, isn't it? It's fairly inaccessible, Morwenstow Church. You can sort of drive down to it and then you've got to go down a bit of a hill, but it's such a peaceful place because there is just nowhere around. It's a beautiful little place. So if you ever get the chance again, I feel like I'm almost working for the Cornish Tourist Board as if they need my help. But it is a wonderful, wonderful place. But, all this talk of Reverend Hawker is meaning that we are conveniently ignoring a haunted object. And I know how much you love a haunted object.
I fucking love a haunted object. If there's one thing I love in this world, it's cats and haunted objects.
Well, Reverend Hawker had the cats, including excommunicated one on a Sunday.
I did very much like that. I wrote down the excommunication of the cat for mousing on a Sunday. That's a joy. I love a object. Do I believe that objects can be haunted? Not necessarily. No. Do I think it is a wild story to say that seeing a box be haunted made you deaf?
Yes. Not just one person, two people. Apparently. I don't know about the psychology behind that, but that's what the story says.
I would say that if that part of the story is true at all, how these things tend to get added on over time. Mm-hmm. If it is true that these two women went deaf because of a haunted box, why aren't we hearing more about this? You know what I mean?
There should be something in the Lancet about this and some sort of medical investigation into it. But no,
this should be a whole paranormal subset, paranormal objects that make you lose one of your senses.
You know what? I'm going to go further. I'm going to say we should now be quoted in the Lancet, and someone does need to look into this.
Thank you. Somebody, Tim Cloke, 2025. Thank you.
Edited
sort of by Emma Ossenbrook, 2025.
I haven't given you too much work to do in that respect. But it is a horrifying thought, isn't it, to just sort of lift the lid of a box and there to be something as awful as an open-eyed, bloodied man in there, and then closing it in frights. And as an army surgeon in the 19th century, you had seen some stuff. I mean, surgery was not exactly scientific at that point.
When you're expecting to see stuff, you're not expecting to open a Spanish chest and there's a slit-throated man staring back at you. Obviously, you close it in fright because you're like, oh my God, that's not what I expected to see. And then you open it and he's gone. That's some classic haunted chest activities.
And of course, it's a Spanish Armada chest. Of course it is.
Of course it is. What else would it be?
And coming from Ireland, about all those dark-haired Irish people who, of course, are descended from the survivors of the Spanish Armada. I'm hoping the sarcasm is sort of coming through here because
it is.
There's very little evidence of that. But there is enough of it in the sort of folklore and the traditions that even some Cornish names have got sort of Spanish overtones, and they're much more about the trade that went on between the Iberian Peninsula and Cornwall because they're actually quite geographically close. I mean, I've got a great uncle whose name is Denzel, which is one of those names. I mean, have you ever heard of anyone actually called Denzel rather than Denzel Washington? I mean, not really. I've had people say to me, I mean, Denzel, you don't ever hear anyone actually called Denzel. And you sort of say, well, actually, my great uncle is. And they're going to go, oh,
yeah, I don't think I've ever heard of Denzel or Denzel outside of Denzel Washington, obviously, who I was in the same room as recently.
Do you know what? I'm sure he says that he was in the same room as Emma from Real Life Ghost Stories as well.
I actually think he probably does say that, yeah.
Hey, he's been in some good Shakespeare productions as well. And, we almost passed over the Richard III reference earlier. I've got to make a Richard III reference.
Thank you. I enjoyed it. I did celebrate the Richard III reference. You cannot do an episode without a Richard III reference. It is very important.
If I can get one in there, I always do. And I must say about this episode, I wrote this during the Christmas holidays when, of course, it's Christmas. So I'm going around and I'm visiting family. I've checked a few details with various members of the family as well. It's really reminded me of some fantastic happy memories from my childhood. And I feel really lucky to have been to so many of these places and to have experienced them. And I hope that some of that enjoyment has transferred onto you guys, the listeners, as well. Because it is a magical place. And I would just like to say, Emma, thank you so much again for indulging me and letting me come on. And I hope that people have enjoyed this little slice of Cornish folklore and there's been no overlap with what you've done before.
Oh my God, Tim, it's been a pleasure to have you on. Please don't ever thank me for coming on because it just is lovely to sit and be told stories and I thoroughly enjoy it and the listeners thoroughly enjoy it and you are wonderful. And to Tim's mom, I didn't swear as much as I did the last time, okay? So I did my best.
Dad doesn't mind, but yeah, Mum's not so keen. The other thing is, I've actually written 2 more episodes as well, haven't I? We'll have to decide if and when we're going to do them. Are we going to give them a bit of a teaser as to what they're going to be on?
Go on, give a bit of a teaser so people know what's coming up.
During 31 Days of Terror, I did Haunted Battlefields, which was a pretty chaotic episode for us. It was the longest one we'd ever done, and it went in all sorts of directions. We were both ridiculously tired, as we now are, to be fair. But I was overwhelmed by the reaction to it. I couldn't believe how much people enjoyed that and wanted to hear more of it. And so I have prepared another Haunted Battlefields episode, but with a slightly different tone. There's 2 battlefields we're going to look at, and I'm going to say nothing more about them for now. But as part of my research for that, because I was going to include a much more up-to-date 20th century battle in there, and that evolved into its own episode about just one particular location. And that location is an airfield called Biggin Hill.
You love an airfield.
I love an airfield. It's a bit of history that I'm really passionate about, but it so happens I just found this book. And you know how sometimes you find a book and it is just perfect. I found one of those books a couple of months ago. I read it on the train up to Yorkshire recently, and I just knew that at that point that would have to have its own episode. It just kind of grew into it. But also there's one of the commanders that was associated with that airfield was a really well-known spiritualist who had some really fascinating ideas. So I thought we'd do a bit of a deep dive into him as well. But
yes.
No one will want to hear it, so I'm going to shut up now.
Tim, it has been an absolute pleasure, as always, to have you on. Where can people find you?
Well, they can find me on my YouTube channel, which is called Mr. Cloke History. On that, I do lots of revision videos and things for British, particularly English school children. But there's a whole host of different topics I'm going on up there. I'm currently actually doing a series on crime and punishment in Britain through time, from the Middle Ages up to the present day. So that might well be of interest.
Fascinating.
There's some pretty grisly stuff in there. So because they're all as a playlist, you can, if you like, just have them on in the background and play them almost like a podcast. And you can also find me on my Instagram, which is called Dry Wipe History, where as often as I can, which I'm being perfectly honest, I almost didn't mention it because I've barely touched it lately. I do whiteboard drawings on my school whiteboard of various historical events. So you can have a look at my back catalogue there as well.
They are very good, in fairness.
Thank you very much.
It annoys me that you are so talented. I find it very frustrating.
Well, says you. You've made a wonderful living out of being such a good communicator. And we were joking earlier, weren't we, about how we could barely talk because we're just so tired. But I think we've done all right, you know?
We have done okay. It is 10:30 at night and we have done okay.
And I tell you what, I mean, if someone can send me a massive check in the post, maybe I'll do the rest of the Song of the Western Men. But right now, I think that's me done.
Anybody out there that's listening, massive check en route, please. I want it to be a comically oversized check as well, please. Thank you.
And you'll get a comically oversized performance in return.
Fantastic. Tim, it has been a pleasure. Thank you so much for coming on. We love you. You are wonderful.
Thank you so much. And goodbye from me. Cheers, dears.
Thank you so much for listening to today's episode of Real Life Ghost Stories. If you would like to send in your story, you can do so by emailing it to reallifeghoststoriespodcast@gmail.com. You can also check out the website reallifeghoststoriespodcast.com. And if you are desperate for some extra content, you can subscribe to the Patreon. That is patreon.com/Real Life Ghost Stories, where for $5 a month or $2 a month, you get access to heaps of extra content, as well as every single main and mini episode completely ad-free. And on that note, I shall see you next time.